Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about game engines and feature creep. This is an interesting thing brought up by commenter Lord of Cake, who wrote, I wonder how much of this is feature creep problem related to using standard engines like Unity or Unreal. I've noticed that a lot of older games had very few programmers listed in the credits, that they managed to make a huge game and a custom engine completely from scratch. My hypothesis would be that it's tempting to add features when they're already built into the engine and you merely have to tweak them, whereas having to build them into the engine itself is enough of a barrier to make you stop and think whether you really want or need this specific feature in the game to begin with. Lord of Cake, you are right. He is onto something here, and I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to start, though, by saying feature creep has always existed. Don't pretend feature creep didn't exist in the 80s or 90s before all these game engines came out. It did. But lately, I think feature creep has become way more likely in any particular game because it's so much easier to add in those features because game engines already support them. But I should say, it seems like it would be easier to add. I'm going to talk about what the pitfalls of just going crazy by adding new features, just because the engine allows you to have those features. Let's dive into that. What I've done is I've picked a few things to talk about in terms of engines that features that engines provide. But let me just tell you that back in the days of making your own engine for a game, whenever we made a game, we made a new engine for it. You added the features you needed and the features you had time for, the intersection of those. Because I always talk about, look, you have a limited amount of time and money in your budget, so you debated every single feature because you needed to code it and then test it, and then you could finally add content for it. So you didn't have time in that budget. You didn't have the money in that budget for everything you could possibly think of. You really had to go, what do I need as a feature? What will I have time to make the code for and then the content for with a lot of testing before it goes in? You certainly didn't have time for everything you wanted. Sometimes you didn't have time for everything you needed, and then you had to go back and change what game you were making. But I think in modern day with off-the-shelf generic engines, many features are available, and I think designers just think, hey, look, I can have whatever I want, right? It's already there. It's free, right? And I think the issue there is you should ask yourself, should you add them? And I think there's a lot of ways of answering that question. So let's look at various features that a lot of game engines provide. And I'll go through what you should be asking yourself if you're working on a game like that. So let's talk about a really simple one that almost every engine provides, and that's scaling creatures. So you can make a model for a creature at one size, and you make a little bitty version of it, and you can make a really big version of it, and everything in between. Because scaling is cheap, and it gives you a lot of variety, because you could have a lot of little, yard trash, the little versions, and then you have the regular size versions, and occasionally you have a big boss version. And you're like, this is awesome. This is cheap. I'm going to do this. But, and this is a big but, does it fit in your setting? Remember, I always say you go setting, story, mechanics. And now you're deciding you've got to have all these different size creatures. But did that even fit in your setting? Will it even make sense? You're kind of putting the cart before the horse here. You're like deciding you want all these different size creatures, but you have no idea if that's even something that belongs in your setting. Also, talking about fitting in your setting, will it literally fit in your combat areas? I've seen people put in creatures, and I've seen this a lot. I saw it decades ago. I've seen it recently. They put creatures in that are too big for the combat area. And what happens is either they clip through a lot of things and it looks awful, or the player can get places the creature can't and then attack with a ranged weapon from that relatively safe, secluded area. Happens a lot. But there's other questions you should ask. Do these scaled creatures even look good? When they're scaled small, do the animations move too fast? When they're scaled big, do they move too slow? When they're scaled real big, do the textures that get applied to them still look good? Because the textures will either get repeated or scaled up and smeared out. Which may make you go, well, if that happens, I'll just make bigger textures, higher res textures. Oh, now you're going to have a bigger install, which I've talked about in another video about why games are so much bigger these days. This is one way that happens. Let's talk about another thing that a lot of engines make very easy. You can put in flying creatures. You don't have to have creatures that walk along the ground. You can have creatures that fly. Hey, that's really cool visually, and it adds a whole lot of variety, not only in how creatures can move, but also how combat can go. But, and I got another big but, does this fit your setting, like I asked with scaling? Does this fit in your areas, like I asked with scaling? Do you have combat arenas that really make sense for creatures to be flying above and in and out of the combat area? Is it going to look good? What kind of interactions can you have? Can the player only attack them with ranged weapons? What if the player makes a melee character? Are these flying creatures going to be something that they literally can't do anything about? Or do the flying creatures have to come down to attack? And that's the brief moment of interaction you can have with them? What if I freeze one of these flying creatures or paralyze it? Does it just fall to the ground or does it stay in place? What exactly is going to happen there? Also, when things fall to the ground anyway, like when you kill them, are they reachable after they fall? How many times have you played a game where a flying creature gets hit and killed and falls to the ground in some area you can't reach? Maybe you're near a cliff and it goes off the edge of the cliff, or maybe it falls into water and you're playing a game that doesn't let you go into water. Maybe it falls into lava. Great. The creature was flying above someplace you can't path to, and now whatever treasure it had is off in that place that you can't path to. Did you just create a new problem for some other designer or programmer in your game to solve? You might have. Let's move away from creatures and talk about dynamic lighting. Dynamic lighting is so good looking. It's great. If your engine supports it, why wouldn't you want it? Well, do you really need dynamic lighting on every spell and every particle effect in your game? Because dynamic lighting can be pretty expensive. Are you watching your frame rate? And even if you're really careful how you build a level with dynamic lights, if the player can do things that create into existence dynamic lights, what if they make a lot of spells and all those spells have dynamic lights going on? What if there are creatures running around and they have dynamic lights on them and do effects themselves that have dynamic lights? What's going to happen to your frame rate? And is it still going to look good? Is the game still going to look good with all that lighting, all that various lighting? Maybe not. Maybe you just lit yourself into a corner. Similarly with physics, I've always talked about, we've done some things with physics in my games, but people seem to think physics are like, this is awesome. You can have breakable objects and props and walls. They can all be broken by the player. Plus you can have creatures that ragdoll or blow apart or do whatever. And this always leads to a bunch of issues, like how do you show in the game what's a breakable wall and what's not a breakable wall? What props are breakable and what aren't? How does it follow some rule that's consistent to the player? This is frequently done, with a visual marker, like the cracked walls are the ones that are breakable. But then people complain that the game is leading them too much because there's always these cracks everywhere. The big question is, does any of this make sense? Is your game world supposed to be this fragile and this easily broken apart? Also, when these things break in the game, is that going to break anything in your game besides the things that just broke? Perfect example of that is, can the players path somewhere now that they couldn't before because they broke the thing that was blocking them, whether it was a prop or a wall? Can the players now get into places they weren't supposed to? Why should I bother learning lockpick when I can just break the wall or the door and get in? These are questions you're going to have to ask. Oh, and by the way, while you're asking all these questions, don't forget that adding physics, especially breakable physics, into the game increases your frame rate because those objects usually have to have also stored the information about how they break and even maybe an animation of how they break, even if you fade it out afterwards. This is all stuff that has to be stored and rendered, and it's going to increase the storage cost and slow your frame rate. Let's look at something else while I'm on a roll here. Let's talk about multiplayer. That's a good thing, right? Network code is hard, but this game engine provides it. You can add multiplayer support really easily. Again, does your story support this? Does it even make sense to have multiple people running around in your story, multiple player characters? Do your play spaces support this? Do you have combat areas that can have 5, 10, 20, 100 players in it at once? Do your mechanics support this? And this is stuff like, if you have a paralysis spell, does it make sense to be able to paralyze a player? Is it fun to be able to paralyze a player? Talked about this before, about some mechanics that are good for NPCs aren't good for player characters. And just how do you handle all these players being in the same space? It's like, how do you connect them? How do you get them in there? In fact, we could talk about, what is your plan for connecting players? Will it be peer-to-peer or will it be server-based? And by the way, having online servers costs money. They have to be sitting in a data center somewhere, and you're paying for the machine, and you're paying for the connectivity, and you're paying for the power. Are you planning to do that? Also, how do you plan to let the players communicate to each other while they're playing? But actually, they need to communicate before they play so they can decide when to log in and what server to log into, and what battle arena to get in line for. And they need to be able to talk during play. But just letting players talk to each other opens you up to a whole bunch of thorny legal issues, including things like maturity ratings. Because even though you may have a not an M-rated game, if players can talk directly at each other, they can say whatever they want, and that may make parents mad, and that may make you have to say, game ratings may change during online play. You've all seen games that say that. Also, some government agencies require you to log all interplayer communication, whether it's text or voice, and voice storage can get really expensive. So you're going to have to look into that. There's a lot of legal things for that. So whenever I talk about making RPGs, I always say story, setting, system mechanics. So what you need to ask yourself, just because a game engine provides you a feature, does this feature make any sense for the setting you're making? Who cares that you can add it, that you can have it? Should you have it? Does it support your setting? Do you need it to tell the story you're planning to tell? Do your game spaces support this feature? How will it perfect performance, both in load, time, and size, and also in frame rate? And finally, you should be asking yourself, what mechanics are foundational to my game? What do I need to have the setting and story I want to have in my game? And separate those from ones that they're available, but they're not really foundational to your game. And that will help you decide whether you should have a feature, not just that you can have a feature. Anyway, Lord of Cake, that was a really good observation you made, and I hope you like this video.